Out here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week is going to be the turn of the writer Patrick O'Neill, who's just brought out a book called Anarchy at the Circle K, which is subtitled On the Road with Dead Kennedys, TSOL, Flipper, Subhumans and Heroin. This book is available from all good bookshops and also available online. This is the interview with Patrick. So after several minutes of casual but interesting chat, we got down to that exciting subject that was the early formative years and also, yes, his early musical moments, I guess. But this is, just to say, this is part of Punk Hostage Press, Hollywood, USA. So there you go, Patrick O'Neill. Just to say, Anarchy at the Circle K. Patrick, tell us about your early musical heroes or influences.
Well, I'm a little older than you, so I'm now 66. So I was born in 56, and everyone, when I was growing up, it was the Beatles and the Stones, and there was that difference there, and I was the Stones.
Yes,
and it went with that kind of music, and really morphed into Jimi Hendrix, Johnny Winters, more guitar oriented, like heavier kind of sound. Alvin Lee, 10 Years After. I mean, that kind of stuff was like more what I was into. And the real moment I sort of got into music was I went to see a Johnny Winters and concert, and he had those things that were called the Marshall Wall of Sounds. Right. This big, huge, just Marshalls across the whole back of the Marshall amplifiers behind the whole back of the stage. And it was in a decent sized club in Boston. It wasn't a huge club by any means. And I lost my hearing for 3 days afterwards. And I thought that was so amazing because all I could hear was this ringing that was so loud. And as Rick Derringer was in the band, and it was he was amazing. He played for 2.5 hours. Like, people don't do that anymore. And it was just insane. And so it's like sort of like, moving into like a heavier sound at that point. And I started going with, like more less hippie rock and more rock.
More rock, yes. Well, I sort of had a brother who was 7 years older than me. He introduced me to the world of prog rock, which was, right. Yes, Genesis, Wishbone Ash, Barclay, James Harvest. But he did also have Black Sabbath and Deep Purple sort of, in there as well. And when you sneak into your older brother's, room to sort of listen to his records when he's forbid you, they just seem like otherworldly. You heard Fireball, you heard Burn, you heard Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, Paranoid. Yeah. It was just like, my God, this is quite something, isn't it? And then you saw them on Top of the Pops, and it was quite rock and roll. It was like, okay, this is not your, normal Top of the Pops, top 10 disco kind of novelty songs that the 70s seemed to be so much full of, actually, at that time. But then, were your parents at all kind of musical or interested?
They were not musical, but my dad is a linguist, or was a linguist. He's passed away. He's a professor of languages, and he taught at Harvard and MIT in Boston. And we traveled all over the world. So like every year I'd move and be in a different country, a different city, a different place. But always someplace frozen and cold, because he followed like Norse languages and languages that had no known written origin. And so right. I lived in Iceland and the Faroe Islands and Denmark, and then all over the States, where he'd go to different colleges to be a adjunct, or in those days it was a assistant professor, and then finally he landed a job at Harvard, and then he went to MIT. And they were way into music, but it was more the folk music. He turned me on to Bob Dylan. They listened to June and Johnny Cash and the Carter Family. They liked a woman singer named Odetta, which I saw way back when. Peter, Paul, and Mary, that kind of stuff. And the only one I could really identify with was Dylan.
Right. Yes.
It was, and but there was a lot of music in the house, a lot of music. They played a lot of music, but they were not musically inclined either.
Yes, well, it was interesting because Penelope Houston from the Avengers was saying that her early musical moment was the Incredible String Band and Pentangle, English folk, and I was like, God, okay, I did not expect that at all. So
Right.
yes, good old folk. I think that's crept into her solo work anyway. So there you go. But then, because in the book, which we'll get into in a bit, but you talked that did you say you were dyslexic in your young?
Yeah. I'm dyslexic. I transpose numbers and words. I transpose numbers verbally. Don't ever get a phone number from me because it'll be wrong. And then words look wrong, and so thank God the reason I can be a writer these days is the beauty of computers and spell check and things like that, and also I've taught myself to work through dyslexia.
Yes.
So it's not as bad as it used to be.
Because in that period, the 60s and 70s, anybody with dyslexia hadn't been properly diagnosed and often were just kind of put in the class of kind of these are the kids who are a bit not going to, who are just a bit, not with it really. Something a bit simple. I don't know what the word is.
I was implied that I was dumb, and I got diagnosed that I had dyslexia when I was 30. Because it was that far, and I'd never really seen anybody about it since. I did really bad in school, and I wasn't very interested in it, and it didn't really ring a bell to me. And I got more into art. I turned to an artist and an illustrator and drew comics, and that's what got me into the Art Institute in San Francisco, where a lot of punk was happening.
Yes, blimey. San Francisco. This is exciting because obviously this was a happening scene, and in the sort of late 60s, early 70s, there was a lot of kind of performance artists at that time. So I'm thinking of bands like the theatre company, the Coquettes, and people like that. Did they sort of come into your orbit at all? This kind of the wacky kind of world of the late 60s and 70s performance artists.
Not really, but there was a lot of it happening at the Art Institute of local people, and I didn't quite understand it. It was it just seemed weird, and there was the clunky videos of it and things like that. It was very strange. I was more into bad student art films. I was a filmmaker,
right?
And those were all pretty horrendous, but interesting, kind of like unprofessional John Waters movies. And it was like a really heady time. There was a lot of art. There was a lot of stuff happening. A lot of beautiful things coming out of San Francisco that was sort of leftovers from the hippie era, where psychedelia and posters and this sort of a lot of painters were around, and it was I think things were just more art inclined at the end. Today there's no computers. Nobody was doing work on computers. Everybody's doing it by hand, and then it was sort of got to be word of mouth to get things around.
I know, it's quite interesting, isn't it? That kind of creativity has changed so much at that point. So as the 70s progressed and we had that kind of wonderful, I guess you weren't quite, how old were you in 1970, 71?
71, then I would be what, like 11, 12 or something like that.
Right. So you didn't have that kind of, oh my God, the 60s are over and all my heroes have died, which was kind of a bit drastic, wasn't it, really? So I was just thinking for a lot of generation, they must have either thought, God, this party's gone bad, or they were just about to get to that age. And you think, oh, right, that chapter is definitely closing quite rapidly. And suddenly a new wave of a new wave of bands was sort of happening. So I think for some bad people, it was a tricky period. So I guess it was 77, 76 when you were at that age where you were leaving school and suddenly punk rock hit.
Right. I mean, I when I showed up at the SF Art Institute, which was 75, bands that I first started hearing about punk rock bands, and so there was Ramones and the Sex Pistols and things like that were coming out at that point, or a couple of years later. And but I sort of gotten off into this is weird. Was this weird to admit? I'd sort of gotten off into fusion jazz and reggae at that point, and some soul music, and so I'd sort of gone in that direction. And that's when I first started playing bass, and I played bass in a horrible reggae band with a bunch of, it was like just bad, and I got into that, but I wasn't, I saw Bob Marley a bunch of times. Saw a bunch of other bands like that, but I was just not. I just was looking for something new. I was looking for something different than the regular rock. I think I saw God, who was it? Just somebody who was just. Oh, I think I just saw. I think it was. I can't remember. Sorry, I can't remember. It was a big English band, and it was Joe Cocker. It was Joe Cocker. I saw Joe Cocker, and they it felt like they were going through the motions. It
Yes.
felt like they were just up there going through the motions. And I go, this is not even spontaneous. I bet you the guy did the same, set list in every city he went to, and he looked bored. I was bored. The audience was bored, and I really liked Joe Cocker, and I was just like, wow, this is really, there just wasn't. And plus, it was in a huge arena. There was like, I don't know, 8,000, 10,000 people there. It was giant. So it wasn't like there was any kind of play from the stage to the audience. It was just sort of like this thing you're watching. I could have watched it on TV for all it mattered.
Yes, well, I think after '69 Woodstock performance, I suppose that was what he was trading off for the rest of his life, really, wasn't he? And it was never going to happen. But I do love the idea. I mean, jazz fusion's a bit strange, isn't it? Jazz fusion, yeah, you've got Weather Report, but reggae in the '80s, I got really into people like Sly and Robbie and Gregory Isaacs and Dennis Brown and all those King Tubby kind of people and obviously Bob Marley. And they were just, it was just roots reggae in the 80s was just fantastic. And we had people like Aswad, Burning Spear, Misty and Roots. So it was just like those gigs would go on for 2 or 3 hours and you just have the best time in your life. So yes, the rhythm section of Sly and Robbie. So with your bass, did you, because I know people like Jarl Wobble, who went on to be part of Public Image Limited, he started with that kind of sort of vibe, didn't he? Did you enjoy playing the bass at that point in your life?
I really like playing the bass. I didn't really understand. I was self-taught. I wasn't able to I can't tell you the chords and number and I'm not a musician per se. I don't read music and things like that. So especially with reggae, it was a real guttural kind of feeling. It was a real you could play if you just got the notes down, and I really liked it. It was a real. It was real. I guess what I'm going at is it was real rhythm. It was just a sound and a rhythm, and it wasn't technique. It was, of course, they were technically good players, but it wasn't all about that. It was about just getting the bass out, just and it's really got a bass heavy mantra going on in a lot of reggae songs. There's just that really repetitive kind of thumping bass, and I also liked it because they were really going for the bottom end. Then, I mean, like that bass in reggae really holds it with the drums, and it was pretty interesting.
Yes, the bass chakra is, I think that was what they were going for. You didn't have to be John Entwistle, did you really? And that
no, not at all. You
didn't have to sort of play some clever little lick up the fretboard and think,
right.
Blimey, how did you do that, John? I'll put the bass down and pretend I never saw that. So yes, It was good. And also, yes, it's good to get stoned too, let's face it. So
exactly.
So as the 70s progressed, I mean, sort of coming up to where you sort of start your book, which is, I have to say, an amazing sort of page turner. I do love the bit with your waking up in a young person's bedroom. Fantastic. I know, because when we were growing up, we used to hear people talking about, like being interviewed in the 70s and 80s, where they would say, the musicians would often say, oh, I got into the band because it was sex, drugs and rock and roll. And you never hear that phrase anymore, do you? I think someone said, don't ever say that again, please, because I'm not sure that was completely legal. So shall we just skip those words never happen, do they? So then the late 70s come, you've left school. Had you left college by then as well?
I let's see. I got out of there in 79 is when I graduated from art school. And so those right in that area was right when I really went to, I saw the Sex Pistols at Winterland, their last show. I went down but sorry, let me back up. Before that, a friend of mine said, you got to come see this band. And I was like, okay. And I went to the Babuhe Gardens, which was the big punk club in San Francisco, and went down. And this is right after, seeing all these other big bands. I think I'd just seen Judas Priest, and I was not that impressed by them. They were Cow Palace, and another big, huge venue in San Francisco. And I went to this club, holds 300, 400 people max, and they probably sell it out twice, so maybe 800. And went in there, and there was a band up on stage. They were Canadian. They're just called DOA, and they're from Vancouver. And 3 guys up there were just going crazy. They were playing, 3-chord punk rock, just churning it out. The Chuck Biscuits, who later went on to play with a bunch of other bands with the drummer, and he literally was knocking his between songs. There was no between songs because he was already hitting his sticks to get the band going, and they played for 45 minutes, and it blew my mind. It absolutely blew my mind. And then the next couple nights was a few nights later, the Ramones played the old Waldorf, which is another club in San Francisco, and I went down to see them. At that point, I had long hair, and a couple of days later, I just cut it all off, and that was it. I was totally interested. Yeah.
So there was two things there. Oh yeah, DOA. They did an album with Jello quite well, not recently, about 20 years ago, didn't they? I think they did one of those kind of albums with Jello, which was people like, I don't know. It featured the song "That's Progress," I think, and "We've Got to Get Out of This Place," I think. But also 78, the Sex Pistols' last ever gig at Winter. Was it Winterland or Winter? Yes,
Winterland.
So the Avengers were supporting that night, weren't they?
The Avengers and the Nuns played.
The Nuns as well.
Yeah, that was kind of one of the reasons I went down, because they were local kids.
Yes,
and I wasn't sure what to think about the Sex Pistols. They were horrible. They really didn't care. Sid Vicious couldn't play bass. It was interesting. It was very interesting.
Yes, Penelope said, I think it was their first or second ever gig. Well, no, it wasn't that.
Yeah.
They must have played a few gigs, but they hadn't got an album out at that stage or any material. Right. So that was quite something for them to play in front of 8,000 people who were
right.
Yes, memorable night, wasn't it? I suppose it was iconic. So did Sid then have his bass plugged in? Because she wasn't sure if Steve had just pulled the plug and said, look, I just can't.
The sound, well, so for one, Winterland was a horrible place to hear music anyway, because it was an old skating rink. I mean, we used to do the ice capades there where they do like skating. So it's all cement. And the noise just bouncing off of there, and it's really horrible. And then the PA wasn't that great. I don't think Bill Graham really wanted to put any money into this. He just did it because it was a spectacle, and he didn't like punk rock, so it was just sort of whatever. And the sound was horrible, and I couldn't tell you what was going on there.
Yes.
The guitar was really loud, super loud, and the drums were up. So the mix was just bad, and it just was interesting,
yes,
to say the least. I don't know if his bass was played in. He looked great on stage. He looked fantastic. He looked like the punk messiah. Him and Johnny running around was just amazing.
Oh, that's right. And I think, yes, from the story from Penelope, that he ended up ODing that night and having to go to the hospital and getting sorted out. It's punk rock, isn't it? Really. So good old Sid. Amazed he lasted that long, really. But then coming up to 82, this is where your book kicks off, isn't it, really? Where you're sort of driving on the Highway 101 with the Dead Kennedys. So how did you'd obviously met DOA or seen them. How did you meet the Dead Kennedys at this stage?
Okay, I was going out. I was living with a woman whose ex-boyfriend was the sound man at the Mabuhay Garden. And we all became really good friends. He lived in the same apartment, so we were all like roommates. And he just sort of gave me through him and a bunch of other people. I just sort of got into the Mabuhay Gardens every night, the club, for free. And that was where things were happening. And I really went down there to hang out. It was really social. Didn't really matter what the band was playing. And San Francisco those days, there was a band playing every night. There was something happening every night. There was a ton of local punk bands, and anybody coming through there, like Devo and Nina Hagen and Blondie. All these people played there. Jim Carroll band, like all these people played there. So there was always a band playing, and I went down there every night and drank, and I got to know everybody. And so I started working at the club, and I started working stage, and which really just meant I got paid to drink and hang out down there. And then I got to know Microwave, which is the Dead Kennedys road manager, and he would hire me for local shows with the Kennedys, but they were always going on tour. And then at one point, he just hired me to go on tour with them as a roadie.
And that was it.
So and I'd seen them play a bunch of times, and and everything. And it was right before hardcore started, and it was sort of before that. There was like a bunch of strange bands around that were sort of under the banner of punk rock. There was like a Silvertone, which was later Chris Isaac. They played kind of a rockabilly. There was No Alternative. There was all these kind of bands that sort of had different sounds, but it wasn't that generic punk that sort of came out of a lot of punk rock. It was a lot going on, a lot of different ones. The Nuns, Magister Ludi. There was all these bands that were really, really interesting. The bands called the Offs that sort of played kind of a soul music. And there's a bunch of bands that were really proficient in music that they played there. The Black Athletes were a great band. It was really interesting, but it wasn't. I mean, it was only punk rock because they played punk rock clubs. You know what I mean?
Yes.
It was just it was hard. A lot of it was really hard to say what it was, but it was really interesting. I think that, like I said earlier about art and everything happening in San Francisco at that time was a really interesting level, because it was sort of like, let's put a band together and let's play, and let's just get out there and do it, and let's not worry about everything else. And that was the amazing thing. It was just like all your friends had bands and everybody was playing down there. It was like one big party every night. It was cool.
It's quite interesting. I think that one of the things that I've noticed from doing so many interviews with English bands and American bands, the American bands, because the place is so big and you're kind of probably isolated in the city, eventually somebody's going to move away and go somewhere else. And you just have to get another member, or you just have to see who's left to form another band. Whereas in the UK, this is a bit of a sweeping statement, but mostly you just stick with those, that one group of people. You go through that 5-year period, you rehearse like crazy, you get the single. In our days, John Peel would give it a play. He was the DJ who loved new music. You get a John Peel session, then you get the first album, you sort of tour, second album, you get the gist, don't you? Things are starting to get a bit tricky. The third album, people just want to kill themselves and walk away, and that's kind of the end of the band. Whereas in America, it is that thing of like people just going, oh well, he went to college, or he had to go, or she went, and then we got another person in, and that band folded, and then we formed another band. And you're thinking, how many bands have you all been in? This is amazing. and everyone sort of has day jobs, because in the UK we had a lot of people had that safety net of unemployment benefits, so you could just kind of sign on every fortnight, go and be a punk rock, be an indie kid. It was fine in the 80s, and there was other schemes that the government introduced to sort of get the numbers down. So there was things like the job seekers allowance or enterprise allowance schemes, which said, look, you can have a year, just get the numbers of unemployed people down, so it doesn't look so bad on our government records for the next election. So it's kind of interesting the way that American musicians just are a lot happier to sort of move cities and also just move around the different lineups, really. So yes, I can see why there's a lot more bands sometimes that happen. But then was it becoming the road manager, or not road manager, but the roadie for the Dead Kennedys? Did you just absolutely love that lifestyle?
Yeah, I absolutely love the lifestyle. Sorry about the phone call. I absolutely love the lifestyle, because we have been talking about it. I was a strung out junkie heroin addict. And so the best part was that I had no responsibilities. I was on the road. I was moving from city to city, living in hotels. Somebody else would clean up my mess, which is the story of my life during that period. Somebody else would always just clean up my mess. And it was, and it was also really, it was kind of, it was egotistical. I mean, it boosted my ego. I was a roadie and then road manager of some of the bigger punk bands in America. It was my identity, and was like really, was something that, because my bands, I had a couple of bands, my bands were never going to be that, they just never were, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I should have stayed at it or something like that. But this gave me the opportunity to do larger shows and huger audiences and be on the road with a band that was actually, making a difference. And all of that was very exciting and very interesting. And we all felt, and I still feel, that we were sort of making history and changing things.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Because your previous book, which came out about 7 years ago, which is Gun, Needle and Spoon, is kind of documents your sort of drug taking. When did you go from sort of like a happy bit of sort of hash to sort of hardcore drugs?
Well, it was at the Art Institute, and the Art Institute, I always say two things happened. One was heroin, the other was punk rock, and there was the at least in the circles I traveled in San Francisco, punk rock, where there was the punk scene was really around a lot of drugs, and it was past the smoking pot and psychedelics. It went right straight to methamphetamine and heroin and cocaine. And so most everybody I knew was indulging in quite heavy narcotics. And I got into it at art school, and I got into doing heroin as a casual user, if that can be said.
Yes.
And then by the time I was working in the industry, I was a full-blown drug addict.
Excellent. There you go. It's got to be done, hasn't it? So I know on the east side, New York, it was so cheap, and everyone just thought, well, this is great. So I didn't realize it was that easy on the west side as well.
Well, yeah, because it was all coming up from Mexico.
Right.
That was pre-cartels, but they had a drug called a black tar heroin that was super cheap and super plentiful, and it was flowing across the border, and it made a whole difference. Before that, when I first started dabbling in heroin, it was like Persian and China white, which was more expensive, and things would happen where it would just dry up and there'd be no drugs in town, which was not great for a heroin addict. And so once Mexico figured out what they were doing, then it was just prolific. It was everywhere, and it was very cheap, and it became like the drug of choice. And the 80s were, before it turned to crack home, the 80s were a big heroin years. It was pretty bad.
How did you sort of get through the syringe period and not sort of pick up some horrendous illness at this stage?
I had hepatitis C, which was supposed to destroy my liver, but then oddly enough, because of some different, getting sober, getting clean off of drugs, and stopped drinking, stopped smoking, stopped eating badly, and taking care of myself, my hep C went away. So, but I mean, I was just very lucky not to get HIV, but San Francisco was like a forerunner in needle exchange,
right?
And they really did a whole lot of stuff with that, and I credit that to my not really catching all the worst diseases in the world, probably.
I know, because I know that in New Zealand, having spoke to quite a few people who were in punk bands during that period, I mean, they all sort of went down with horrendous illness. And there was a guy in the band called the Puddles, George Henderson. I mean, he talked about, all those kind of problems with liver, and having to really sort his diet out, went to the library and really got into good gut bacteria. That was it.
Right.
So he kind of sorted that all problems, and he's completely happy. And I think Martin Phillips from the Chills had the same issues as well, and going down with all those things. And you just have to sort of watch your diet, well, not watch it, just change it quite drastically. Anyway, that's all good. There you go.
Right. Well, I'm an annoying vegan. I meditate. I don't drink. I don't smoke. I ride my mountain bike 15 miles a day. I mean, I'm like, I don't even know who I am anymore. It's just sort of, but that was sort of, because you're kind of paying penance to all the stuff you did to your body before. It didn't exactly treat my body like the temple it was supposed to be. It was, I kind of treated it badly, and I'm paying for it. I'm still paying for it. The teeth are a problem. The health isn't 100%. But it's again, I was lucky.
Yes, well, absolutely. And to be honest, from England, you'll notice that the English have terrible teeth because our dental period. That's a sweeping statement, but
well, I'm Irish. I'm Irish, so my teeth aren't exactly perfect either.
We grew up looking at Donny Osmond, which was quite annoying, and then you sort of noticed that Americans were also beautifully sort of like done, weren't they? So nothing missing there with Donny. But look, 84, big year, because so obviously you're sort of the world of being a roadie for Dead Kennedys is going well, and then you get a really authentic British anarcho-punk band, the Subhumans, didn't you? With Dick Lucas, the great Dick. So how did this gig come along?
Well, John Loder, who was there, who recorded them and worked with the Crass and kind of managed them out, except narco-punks didn't like the word manage. And so he got in touch with the manager of Dead Kennedys in the band TSOL, was Mike Rainey, and said, I got a tour, can you help me? They were like trying to do, I guess Rainey was trying to get us over to England, and so they were trying to mutually talk about things. And Rainey said, yeah, I got somebody. And he called me up and said, you're going to be a road manager, you're going to take the Subhumans on tour across America. And I was like, okay, I'm totally up for it. Because it was like, I want to go to the next level and get up from being just a lowly roadie. Plus, lowly roadies sort of get paid the night they work, not every night they're on the road. And road managers get paid every night, and they get per diem. So it was a better jump financially. And Subhumans flew over with a guitar and a bass, and that was it. They had no other gear. I guess Trotsky had some drumsticks, and so part of my job was also getting gear borrowed from the opening bands, and then we put together a tour, and it was insane. We went out for a month and a half, and I played like 30 shows. It was crazy. It was really grueling. And another thing is none of them knew how to drive. So I did all the drive. I did all the driving.
I wouldn't allow them driving personally, but no, that's amazing. I mean, that must have been a real kind of baptism of fire, almost, having a completely different band from a different country who was sort of, and what were they like? What were the dear old English like in '84? Were they okay or what?
They were amazing, but they were really, this sounds weird, but they were kind of innocent, unlike the jaded Americans who were sort of out being drug addicts. None of them really talked about doing drugs. They drank a lot of beer. They didn't really carouse a lot. They were all militant vegetarians, and I wasn't in those days. It was always kind of bizarre. And they often accused me of pulling over the van in the middle of the night and sleeping because America couldn't be that goddamn big. Because it was just because we drive, like it'd be like, especially on the West Coast, gigs were 1,000 miles away, 600 miles away, 800 miles away. He's driving all night, so I packed them up, jump in the van, go. They were also horrified by American food because they couldn't get what they wanted. They wanted veggie rolls and fry ups and those kind of things. Yes. And they couldn't get it in America. It's just like, McDonald's and meat, and they were horrified. And so we ate a lot of pizza. Yes,
you were carb loading, weren't you? That's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because that's the other thing. Because I've noticed with a lot of British bands, and there's a 5-year narrative I've slightly mentioned, like the second and third album. There's a kind of lack of money. They hate each other. And the other thing that breaks British bands is they often would say, oh, we went to America and we came back and broke up. And it was just like, we just couldn't deal with it. So there is this kind of vastness. And I must admit, there's been a couple of times when I thought, oh, shall I go to that gig? Oh, it's an hour away. And then I'd be talking to someone in America and I go, oh yeah, we drove 9 hours to go and see The Clash in this. And he went, oh my God, I feel so rubbish now. It's like, you believe it. You would have driven all that way to see a band, and we would just be. So I do think the English British are a little bit pampered at times on that front. And also, I mean, Dick went to a public school, and he probably had, benefits and not inherited benefits, but we would have just got Social Security, housing benefit, council tax. It's a little bit of a, you weren't really struggling too much, really, even if you pretended to. You were going to be caught. I mean, nowadays they don't have those safety nets in this country, so you end up sleeping in a doorway, and that would be the end of you. But in those days, you would get £30, unemployment, and that would be fine. But it's funny. Right. There was probably beer and cider. Because they came from the West Country, didn't they? Subhumans.
Yeah. That was and they were horrified there was no cider in those days. It was all beer and everything like that.
They were,
but I had an interview with Razor Cake. It's a DIY punk magazine out here in Los Angeles. And we talked about the Subhumans, and what really came down to is like those guys couldn't do anything else. I can't see any of them working at 7-Eleven or at a corner store or something like that. Dick's not going to go out and be a hod carrier or a laborer or something like that. It's just not going to happen. It was really interesting. Some of the people in the bands, I can see them I can see some of them being in commerce or being in trading stocks or something like that. But the Subhumans were definitely this is them. This is what they're going to do. This is their gig.
Yes, they'll be living in some little place. But in the book, there's a fantastic bit which I just thought was so beautifully told of you waking up in a young woman's bedroom and looking at posters. It was Echo and the Bunnymen and Duran Duran posters, and you didn't have a clue, did you, where you were?
No,
not even what city, not who that person was.
No. I was in Kansas City, and we had a night off, and we went down. And the band from San Francisco called the Dicks was playing, and we went down there. I had a bunch of Valiums, and I drank a bunch of beers, and I met some young woman, and then I woke up in a bedroom in God knows where, and I pushed the curtain back, and we're out in the country. There's like trees and stuff like that, and I'm like totally freaked out. And it turned out we went home to her parents' house and like probably had sex, and I can only assume that. And then I woke up, had breakfast with her family, which was just goddamn bizarre. It was so weird. And dad felt like an ex-cop or something like that. And mom was just sort of, mom. And it was scary. It was totally scary. But apparently, it was actually Shawnee Heights, Texas. Oh, sorry, Shawnee Heights, Missouri or Kansas. It was Kansas, and I was trying to get back over to Kansas City, Missouri, and we were like 30 miles away or something like that. It was pretty crazy. So it was weird. But yeah, it was weird. And then there's another part of the book where she shows up again, because actually she showed up. There's other parts I didn't include in the book, but she would then go on tour with other people in other bands, and I would run into her the whole time for years. And it was like sort of watching her digression into being a total drug addict and punk rocker. It was pretty bizarre, because she was kind of a sprite and happy when I first met her. Not that I'm responsible for sending her.
No, well, you had very from the description, you had very little memory of who she was, and
right,
having to sort of play catch up, which I just think is hilarious, especially when it's like, oh my god, we're in your parents' house.
Yeah, right.
And that's your dad, and now your mum, and now I'm sitting at the breakfast table, and that's your brother. I mean, right. that's a lot to catch up, isn't it, for your brain to process while feeling probably a bit hungover.
Well, one thing that's really interesting, or at least to me it's interesting, is that's the first chapter I wrote, because that's one of the strongest memories I have on tour, because there's so much emotion attached to it. And I sort of was playing around with things. This book was a little hard to write because it was more it was like when drugs were working, sort of, and it was sort of this thing there was much more emotions involved. I mean, it might sound like weird because the other one was drug addicts and bank robbery and things like that, but this one was like, when I was younger, I really loved it. It was a great thing, and I tried to keep trying to convey that. And so one of the first chapters I wrote was that chapter, and I sent it out to a bunch of people trying to get some interest in the book from agents and publishers, and they were horrified that what I was doing and sleeping with a underage woman, or they were like, yeah, I guess I'd have to see the rest of the book. But it's funny that you mentioned that, because that's actually the first thing I wrote that actually started the book, the genesis.
Yes, and that's still one that sort of it's so beautifully told, and I just love that description. I remember sort of reading people like Hunter S. Thompson's Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, and there's that great thing of the road trip, and it's good when it's good, isn't it? And you're getting away with it. As the decade progresses, and obviously the more you keep doing the same thing, and one spiral starts to go down, when do the wheels start to slightly slip for you during that decade?
Well, I mean, like I talk about in the book, what was about to be like, 84 and 85, I stopped being able to clean up, because what I actually would do is I would kick dope before I went on tour, with the idea I would stay clean the whole time I was on tour, and of course find some drugs somewhere and get strung out again. But as my drug habit, progressed, I was unable to do that. And so I'd go out on the road, which is just insane to go out on the road with a certain amount of drugs, thinking they're going to last a long time, and then run out in, Chicago, or run out in Texas or something like that. And like, what do I do? And trying to figure that out. And so things got just a little more, the Kennedys went from playing 1,000-seat halls to 3,000-seat halls, and then they're going to 5,000-seat halls, and then there would be 3,000 people outside the hall because it wasn't big enough, and everything got ramped up a bit, and it stopped being sort of let's go on the road and screw around and see what happens. It got let's go on the road, we're making money, we're doing this thing, and we're touring heavily, and we toured nonstop for the whole time I was with them. We constantly toured. I was every 3 times a year we were out touring for like a month, month and a half, so it was a lot.
And what was it like seeing the band that close and seeing the tensions as it sort of unfolded for you, sort of being around them?
Well, there was a lot of conflict in ideology going on, and Biafra was truly punk rock, politically correct. This is what we need to do, And he was sort of adamantly against going to the next level, which would have been, eventually arenas or whatever, how that was going to look like. And he wanted to keep it because he had more control. Well,
Yes.
the Kennedys did something really, really amazing. Was that they had their fingers on the pulse of who was in that city, and they picked the opening bands, which usually is the revenue. The promoter would do that, and they kept the ticket prices low, and they did all these sort of things because it was more about getting the music out there, and we played a bunch of tiny towns like that would never expect the Kennedys to show up, and we used to call them turd town tours, because they were like these little crummy tours, and we play all over the place, and it was amazing because we'd be in the middle of Canada in some little city, and 3,000 kids would come out of the woodwork, come see us, because at that point we were one of the biggest punk bands in America. And Ray was looked at it more economically, or more as a living, a career, money, and so they were butting heads. And then there was certain camps of what was going on, so that was starting to unfold. And so what it used to be that they would travel together, and the crew would travel separately. They stopped traveling together. And part of my job was actually getting them separate plane tickets. And I mean, literally, Ray and Biafra would not even be on the same plane anymore. It was that turn into that kind of thing. And a lot of times, yes, the part of the band would fly with us when we flew places, fly with the crew, especially when we went across country and things like that. That was all sort of there, and Biafra wasn't. He was separated, and it just became it became like, are you with Ray or are you with me?
Right.
And I wasn't. I was with anybody. I was running the show. That's what I'm doing. But it's just sort of, I don't know. Lead singers are a total different animal than a lot of other people, and they take a lot more attention. And I think there's a little bit of jealousy there, and then you get things you're talking about, which was like being in the same building all the time, drilling together, doing all this thing together, and then on top of it all, there's royalties and songwriting rights and all these other things that people are making more money than other people, and then on top of it all, there's this huge amount of merchandise coming out, and there's a split on that and how that works and how that doesn't work, and it's just there's so much involved, and it really comes down to whose ideology you want to go with.
Yes.
But I mean, a reality, we had to go to bigger venues. It wasn't like a typical was in Chicago. We were playing in a venue that holds 3,000 people, and there was 4,000 kids outside, and the riot happened. Because they couldn't get in. There's no way for them to get in. They didn't have tickets, but there was 4,000 punk rock kids on the street in front of the venue. And so it just didn't make sense. Plus, it didn't make sense us not getting another 4,000 kids into the audience. If it's there, and just saying I don't want to go bigger doesn't really, do that, And we come to towns, and there'd be clubs we had played at, which were 800 seats, and then we'd be in a different club that was 3,000, and you can't look back and say, oh, we should be playing at 800 seat club, because that doesn't make any sense,
Yeah. It's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned lead singers, because I did an interview with the guitarist Damien O'Neill from the Undertones and that Petrol Emotion, and obviously there was a lot of issues with Fergal, and the band and him sort of splitting, becoming a solo artist, and then sort of bringing the band back together, more of a and not a novelty act, but just reforming, saying let's just do it for fun, get a different lead singer, and we'll just enjoy it. And then yes, he was talking about bands like U2. You obviously sit there and think, we could have a really big thing here, couldn't we? And we could make this work, but we'll have to sort of engage our brains and think of the big picture. Otherwise, we could really mess this up. So there's not many bands who do the U2. And I know everyone has an opinion or dislikes U2 for being successful. But at the same time, anybody who's been in a band think, my God, on one level, they're amazing, aren't they? They kept it together when they could have obviously walked away and all hated each other and ended up having to do, crummy little jobs.
Right. Well, I think also, we started out where like people like Bill Graham and San Francisco and other big promoters wouldn't booking us. We were the troublesome black sheep of the music family, and then it became a thing where we couldn't be denied. We were big bands, and just the progression of the road crew. The road crew was in a van for a long time, and then all of a sudden we're in a truck. We're in a huge truck full of merchandise and gear. I mean, it just that was the progression, and so it's just how it works, and you want it to work that way. You want your popularity to be there. You want to be a band that's going to play in front of people, and I think a lot of people put the sort of punk can't get that big, but I mean, once our time was over, there's other bands, like horrible bands like Green Day and Blink 187 or whatever they are, whatever it is, all those bands, they proved it wrong. They went to be huge bands. They were allowed to.
Yes.
I think we paved the road. I know we paved the road for that, but I think a lot of it was our limitations on ourselves, that we couldn't see ourselves out of the club. And that wasn't true. Even if we were just opening for another band, we could have played arenas.
Yes, it's kind of quite a British mentality in a bizarre way, because normally that's what bands like the Clash did, or the Sex Pistols.
Yeah.
I mean, the Sex Pistols are a bit of a different thing, but I love bands like the Smiths, and obviously they just couldn't contain that kind of creative energy, and everything gets so tense. But I don't know, it's surprising that an American band who's got a different education, family, different values, kind of are so easy to implode. You just look at the amount of bands from the UK, who just kind of, you think, God, they just didn't have that conversation saying, should we just not blow this? Because actually this is quite a big thing, isn't it? It's kind of weird. So, because in the book, I mean, was it, because you've got this relationship with Annalisa, haven't you? Which is quite, was it quite hard writing the book and bringing all these kind of memories and emotions back to you? Or is the writer, is this kind of what you not enjoy, but, something that really pulls the narrative together?
Well, I mean, like with writing my first book, there's a lot of really hard memories to look at, and there are here too, especially as that digresses to getting to be harder and harder, being on the road, just because of my own lifestyle. And so there's a lot of memories you pull up. They're not all as funny as, being in Kansas and waking up in a woman's bedroom. And it gets more and more difficult. And the thing with writing is it's not like you just knock it off and then you're done with it. You sort of stay with chapters for a week or so. You're sort of in there, you're digging around. And, like I always kind of say with my first book, you can't make yourself look good, when you're not doing good.
Yes.
It's impossible. So you really got to write the emotions and the vulnerability, and you got to let people see you for who you are. And that's difficult too, and there's a lot of second guessing, and there's a lot of, should I say that? And there's things that, there's a scene in here that, me and Chris, the sound man, we were gacked out on cocaine, and we called in a bomb scare at one of the Kennedy shows because we didn't want to go work. And I don't want the band to see that. That's horrible. Their crew just screwed them over, screwed over their show. And boys, I know, but that's where you have to show that. You have to show it,
Yes.
There's the beginning tour of the band TSOL. I'm on a tour, and it was it was the first time I was working for a different band, and I got my ass kicked. I got stabbed. I got beat up. I got all these things happening on the first leg of the tour. My leather jacket stolen, all stuff like that, and I'd like not to say that, like not to tell people that happened, that, I'm this big heavy roadie and I got this together, but it's learning by baptism. You sort of get into the fire and you do it, and so those are hard. It's really hard to show that stuff, but that's what makes good writing. That's what really makes good writing, because you want to see that. You don't want to see somebody saying, I'm this amazing guy and I did this. I'll just throw that book away. I don't care. Even if he is an amazing guy, I'm not going to read that damn book, And so it just makes better reading to actually see someone vulnerable and see someone actually showing themselves for real.
Yeah, because it's really the spiral down here, the spiral going down when you go to hospital with Annalise, and that's it's quite graphic, isn't it? And quite sort of depressing the way it's real, but it's quite beautifully told at the same time. I just wonder what it was like reliving all that kind of moment, realizing that things have got to such a bad spiral, at this point. So what was that like for you?
Well, I mean, the one thing I gotta remember is the time of the year. I mean, the time, the dates, is that punk rockers weren't in those cities. A lot of them, like there wasn't like this huge punk contingent in mid Texas. In college towns there was some, and so we were looked at as looked like some strange people. And down south in America, we were looked at Northerners. We were Yankees, and so it was really bizarre. and it was everyone said it's a mistake taking my girlfriend on the road, but taking my girlfriend on the if I didn't take her on the road, she got in trouble at home with drug dealers and stuff, and it was just more work for me to get back. And it's it was difficult to write about that and to remember all that and how we were looked at. I mean, I write about how DH, the drummer, was who was in the punk world, is very white. He's black, and him going through America and having to deal with that too. It's just we felt alienated. We didn't feel like we were part of, and kind of that was part of the punk thing. Like, I'm different than you. I'm more worldly. I got better ideas than you do, or whatever the egotistical thing was. But a lot of it is just feeling like we really felt like we were part of the world. We were a separate reality in a lot of ways.
Yes, and does it? Because obviously the timing of the book is quite, amazing because of what happened, last week or 2 weeks ago with DH.
Yeah,
That must have been really horrendous for you.
That blew my mind, but DH hadn't been well, but he'd just gone on tour. The Kennedys just finished up tour in Europe, playing big, huge shows all over Europe, and he got back, and I'm sure he was drained. I'm sure he was tired. I'm sure he wasn't in good shape, and he fell down in the bathroom and hit his head on the sink, and it was blunt force trauma on the head. He passed away, and a friend of a friend who was taking care of his dog came over to see him, and he knocked on the door and he got no answer. Got the landlord to open the door, and they found DH. And it was just, GH was a larger than life guy. He was really a personality, really amazing guy. I've known him for 40 years.
Yes,
I've been hanging out with DH for 40 years, and he lives in Los Angeles. So I saw DH, 3 times a week probably. And I didn't know what to feel at first. I just didn't know what to feel. It just didn't feel real. And there's a certain level when that happens, when somebody dies and you're not party to it, or you're not there, or something like that. It's like, is that really real? And I keep expecting to see him, and that sort of sunk in. And I found out through a friend of a friend, and I called him and said, "This real? I mean, how because you always hear someone, so not always, but you hear rumors of people dying and things like that, and it's always crap. And I said, how reliable is your source? And he goes, it's really reliable. I mean, I know this happened. I was like, oh my God. And then, social media blew up, and everybody's doing all this stuff, and it's just like, oh boy, it's pretty rough. It's pretty rough. And but that's our age, we're not young guys anymore. We're getting up there, and the only solace I have in this whole thing is that DH got to play another tour. He got to go out, do what he wanted to do, love doing it, and it just gotten home, and that gives me hope, and I feel, not that I'm happy that ever happened, God no, but I think that just it makes it feel a little less rough.
I think they'd also got a tour of the UK lined up for next year from memory, but
I'm sure they do.
Someone said they were doing it. What was it like when the Dead Kennedys, break with Jello? What was that moment like for you? Because obviously you'd been with them for such a long time.
Yeah, well, I was removed by that time. I had gone off on my drug addiction and was in a bad place, and I'd worked for Alternative Tentacles for a while. I worked there for about 1.5 years, and I was doing, all the posters and album covers and things like that. And then I attempted to clean up my act, and I went back to the East Coast to stay with family and try and kick heroin. And so I sort of lost touch with everybody. And that's when my really good friend Will Shatter from Flipper died, and a bunch of other things were happening. And so I sort of stepped away from the music industry. Plus, I was pretty much unemployable at that point. I really couldn't go on tour. Had such a bad heroin habit. And then when I came back out years later, and I moved to LA, that all that stuff started with them, and I didn't get involved. I don't want to get involved. I got, a lot of people talked to me about it, and there are people in certain camps that felt this and that, and felt it was very un-punk rock to get lawyers and whatever. I think everybody has their side, and I think there's viable arguments. But I also, in the end, I think the band should get paid. Whatever that looks like, and for Ray, that sort of hit that rate, Ray's another person. He doesn't have a job at Safeway or the grocery store. That's what he does. And so I think all that happened, and so I just didn't become involved. But I was sort of sad that it really sort of, well, it wasn't good enough anyway. I mean, it wasn't a good anyway. None of them were talking to each other anyway, so it was sort of in a bad shape. But it became us and Biafra, or Biafra and them, and I think that's unfortunate, because there will never be a reunion of the whole band again, ever.
No. I saw Jello's kind of comment about the dead Kennedys, after DH died. So
Yeah.
it was like, yes, he sort of, I don't know how he feels. But then, so on the book, it's coming towards the back end where you got to the bit, if I should fall from grace with God, 1998. So just to describe what's the situation with you just around this time, because this is when you go to jail.
Yeah, this is, well, I had gone all the way into the alternative underworld pretty much at that point. I like to say the only thing punk rock about me in those days was I had a leather jacket, and I was shooting a huge amount of heroin. I was really strung out. I couldn't sell enough drugs or do whatever drug addicts do, or petty crimes like that, and I turned to armed robbery. And
Right.
which it was a progression. It happened. It wasn't just like, I'm going to be an armed robber. It was sort of like it got, sort of went there, and I started robbing banks, and I got away with it for a couple of years, year and a half, and then finally got nailed. And and I hadn't talked to anybody. I hadn't talked to anybody in bands. I hadn't talked to anybody in the music. I had really become, I lived on a 4-block radius. I never kind of really left it except to go do armed robberies and score drugs. That was it. My world had become very, very small. And I got arrested and I got charged with multiple counts of armed robbery in the state of California. They have what's called 3 strikes law, and they want to put you away for life for 3 major offenses, and they were trying to put me away for 25 to life, the rest of my life in prison. And so I was in a really bad way, but I was also in jail fighting that, and a lawyer, and it just means you just constantly going to court and dealing with it. And you get visitors in jail, things are happening. And
Yes.
I got called on a Saturday. It said, you have a visitor. I'm like, who the hell is visiting me? And I went out there, and it was Ray and Microwave, the old road manager, and Winston Smith, the Dead Kennedys artist. And they were on the other side of the glass, and we're sitting there, and it was awesome to see them. It was amazing. It was beautiful to see them, but also just hit me how far away I'd gotten from who I was. I just gone off the deep end into something else, and I was no longer that musician kid, the kid that was interested in art and music and doing things. I was just somebody that was a thug with a gun shooting dope. And that really hit me, but it really, there's two worlds colliding, like really colliding hard, and it was that kind of stuff that I made the decision that I was done. I was done. I'm not going. I'm not going to prison the rest of my life. That's not that would just be the worst thing to happen to me in the world, because prison's horrible.
Yeah.
So it's just one of those things. It was like a reminder of who you were and who you could be. And I spent my whole life now, which is now 22 years past that, getting back to being that 17-year-old kid that went to art school that's interested in music and art and writing and all that stuff like that. And that's who I want to be. That's what I want to be now.
But how did you avoid not spending the rest of your life in jail then? What was the process of that not happening? Because obviously thinking, right, that's it. Sorry,
right.
It's kind of a bit, yes. So how do you manage to sort of convince them this really is true?
Okay. Well, California was really gung ho, and the fact was that I had no other offenses. They were going to just 3 strike me at once, so it was kind of not exactly right. And my lawyer got in there and really pulled a bunch of motions and worked with them. And there was all these kind of deals on the table, like 2 strikes and 20 years and this and that and back and forth. And then I sat in county jail fighting the case for 18 months. And by the end of the 18 months, they, like my lawyer said, you just got to wait till you're not the flavor of the month anymore. You got somebody worse is going to come along that makes you look better, and they're going to be all gung ho on them. And the DA was could work with me, and so my lawyer went back and forth, and basically what it came down to is I was going to take 2 strikes and 4 years. 2 years I'd already served, and 2 years in state prison. And I heard that, and I was like, okay, because we've gone back and forth, 12 years, 5 years, 6, all these things. And when I heard 4 years, and I talked to my lawyer, he said, take the deal. And I was sitting in the back of the court, in the bullpen, which is the holding cell outside the court. And the DA came up to me, and he said, you, Mr. O'Neill, I'm so and so. And I'm like, yeah, whatever. And he's like, I think we found a cost-effective way to deal with people like you. And I was like, what are you talking about? And he said, you're the kind of drug addict that we're going to give you 2 strikes, and you're going to go away for 2 years, and you're going to come back out, and you're such a bad drug addict, you're going to commit another felony, and we're going to put you away for life. And that's going to be easier and quicker than anything else we can do. And I was like, wow. And all I could think in my mind was, I'm getting out. I have a date. I'm getting out of here. But those words stuck with me for a long time. California doesn't want to go to trial about anything because it costs so much money. So that they're trying to make some kind of deal. So that was his logic. That was his logic that I was going to do it. And I defied him. I didn't go back.
Yes, my God. So you just spent 2 years and then yes, you cleaned up.
Yeah. I spent 2 years in county, and then I spent 18 months in prison, and got out on parole, and was out on parole for 4 or 5 years there.
So then how did you turn around your life? Because obviously it's like you don't want to go back, but you've had the addiction, you've had decades of kind of like mixing with probably people who aren't going to help too much. So how do you then sort that bit out? There's a slight, there's quite a lot there, isn't there?
Yeah. Well, I was in county jail. There was a drug treatment program you could go to, and I went into that. It was crazy. It was, but it sort of started the thing. And what it did was I stopped using drugs in jail. I stopped doing everything. And by the time I got to prison, I wasn't doing drugs, and when I got there, like the gangs and people like that, they don't want really anything to do with you if they can't get something from you, if you're not buying drugs, if you're not looking for sex, if you're not doing contraband, if you're not doing something like that. All I wanted was out of there. That's all I wanted. I just want out of there. And so I had laid low. I got out of there. And when I got out, I went to a rehab, and I just said, you got to take me in. I got to come give me here, because state of California sends you out of prison with $200. They give you $200 and say, go live your life. And I'm like, I'm a drug addict. You just handed me $200. I haven't used drugs in almost 2 years. This is crazy. And I knew I was in a bad way. And I kept hearing that guy saying cost-effective way to deal with people like you. I was like, oh man. And I went to a drug treatment program and went in there, and it was hardcore. It was behavior modification. They just yell at you, scream at you. And I was in there for 18 months. And they said, you can stay with us for the rest of your life and hang out here and be part of this structure, or you can get out on your own. And I said, I'm going out on my own. I got this. I'm all good. And I went out, and some stuff happened in my life, and I started shooting dope again. And I kept thinking, I'm gonna go back. This guy's gonna bust me. I'm going to prison. I was sort of watching myself do that. And at that point, I put myself into like this bottom of the line, hardcore, religious. Even it was Salvation Army drug rehab. There was like a men's shelter, and I put myself in there, and I got it in there. I got it, and I started going to the AANA and stuff, and cleaned up my act, and that was 22 years ago.
Wow.
And it was. It wasn't easy, man. It wasn't easy. But what's the alternative? And I started writing in San Quentin. I was in San Quentin. I was in a writer's group. I started writing in county jail, but I started writing for Ernest in San Quentin. And that's where I wanted to be. I wanted to be a writer. And I really got into it. And with about 4 years clean, I went back to grad school, got my master's degree in creative writing, and with the idea to teach college. And then 10 years later, I with a pro bono lawyer, I went to the state of California and asked for my record to be expunged, and they said no, and they gave me a certificate of rehabilitation, but that put my name on the governor's desk, and that was back when Jerry Brown was governor. He's a very liberal guy, and the Christmas of 2015, his secretary called me up and said, "We're giving you a governor's pardon. We're going to clear your name." And so they expunged my record. I mean, the governor of California, gave me a clean slate. So, and because of my book, because of my writing, because of teaching college, because of being in the recovery community, so it's a full circle.
Crikey, that is an amazing story, isn't it? That is just, I mean, I have to say, when you said you started taking drugs again, I thought, oh my God, that was the one thing I didn't expect to hear there. I just thought that was the happy end, it was like, that was it. I didn't realize you slipped, and it's like, geez, crazy.
And that's addiction, that with the idea that I could go away for 25 to life and I'm still using. That's the pull of the drug, and that's when I realized that I'm in trouble. I'm in trouble, like not like before where it was like slap on the wrist or consequences or whatever. This was real. This was really real, So that was it.
So that was, I mean, what was it? What's the thing that's really was the turning point from that Salvation Army rehab place? What was the thing that really stopped you getting that addiction back again?
I went in, I was horrible. I was just angry. I was mad about it. I wanted to lash out at everybody else, which is crazy because I put myself in there. It was all my fault anyway, right? But I just was I was an addict. I was just, just blaming everyone in the world. And so I made a deal. And I said, if my life's not better in a year, then I'm done. I'm going to go back out there, but I'm going to follow all the rules. I'm a horrible rule follower. I have a problem with authority, obviously, all these things happening. And I said, I'm just going to do this thing. And I did it. And, damn it, my life got better. It got a lot of better. Within a year, I had a job that was decent. I had an apartment, I had a car, I had all these things happening that were, not just monetarily, I had peace of mind. I had, I had a sense of self. I was, if I'm not a drug addict or a bank robber or working in the music industry, who am I? And I had an identity. And I was a writer, and I was these things. And it was like this. It was like here. You want a life? Here it is. And and my idea always since day one is like I need to be a rock star. That's what I need to do. That would have been the perfect life. And like that, if I'd been a rock star, I would have killed myself. Yes. But it sort of handed me a life that was doable. It's not as glamorous and as amazing as being a rock star, of course. Who cares? But it was like do you want to be creative? Do you want a job where you help people? Do you want to be part of the system and not taking from it? And I like to call it in rhythm with the universe. I'm in rhythm with the universe now instead of being against the grain the whole time. And this was the hardest thing I had to figure out. I had the feeling that I had to quit everything and sort of be this mainstream guy and, you part my hair in the middle and go, go get a regular job again, 7-Eleven or something like that. And I was like deadly afraid of that because that was like everything I was against, especially with punk rock. And I didn't have to do that. I don't have to do that. I can still be me. I can still have my values. I can still be a punk rocker. I can still be all these things, but I just have a sense of being part of humanity rather than not, and it's not like I sit around love everybody, especially not in America. There's half of us are out of their minds, it just became a way of dealing with things in a different way that was like, and part of it is like, punk rock was very nihilist. It wasn't going anywhere. We live fast, die young, all that stuff. And, I obviously missed the die young part. So it was sort of, I had to do something. And, I had to find things that gave me joy and I felt good about. And those are all foreign languages to me. It was very weird. And I did. I figured that out. Now am I amazingly happy and my life is amazing? Not all the time, but it's close to who I was a million years ago when I was an artist.
So when did you do the vegan and the health? When did you have those kind of new habits? When did they sort of appear in your life?
That's been a progression. I smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day and all that stuff like that. And I was working at I also work in a drug and alcohol rehab. That's my day job. And I was working in a drug and alcohol rehab, and there was a dog running around. I was trying to catch the dog, and I could barely breathe. And I go, "What the hell? Stop smoking." A year later, I'd worried about kind of my diet. I'm eating a lot of crap. I'm sort of like eating like a junkie still. I mean, like, McDonald's and garbage. And I'm not feeling good about myself in a heavy depression. And I was like, I'm going to stop eating junk food. And then it was like progressed into pescatarian and all that kind of stuff. And then it became vegetarian. And I was that for 18 years. And 3 years ago, I became a vegan. And it's sort of the progression. I meditate. I do yoga. I do all this crap. That was so not punk rock because it's a progression. It's a progression of action. And what it really comes down to is when I'm not a drug addict, I start actually care about myself.
Yes.
And I'm not getting younger. I'm 66 years old, and I'm not one of those people that can't wait for it to get over with because it's so horrible. I have a lot of stuff I want to do. I got some more books in me. I got things that are happening. I'm playing music again. I'm doing all these kind of things. I'm excited for what life has to hold. So I don't really want to keel off of a cardiac arrest, tomorrow from eating too much garbage and stuff like that. So it's just been one of those things. And
Amazing.
I used to jog, which was just bizarre. I used to run around the city, and my knees sort of started giving out, and so I picked up the bicycle. And I'm on my bicycle everywhere. Which were things back in the '80s I would never be seen doing. I mean, there's no way. It was just there's exercise. They're crazy. So
Yes, well, I've started, I got into all that kind of stuff. I'm more of I'm vegetarian than vegan,
Yeah.
but the whole exercise thing is just like, I think I started seeing people my age and I'm thinking, God, you look ancient. You look actually quite old. And the worst thing, they would put on their social media a picture of them when they were 18. I'm thinking,
yeah.
Yeah, but you're not 18, mate, are you? And
Not a good look.
that makes it even worse because you go, God, you were really good looking, but now you just look like a really tragic old man, or woman, and it's a little bit like, shit, that's not a good look, is it? It's not good.
No.
And so with that, because you said at the beginning, about your father, how did your parents cope seeing your life through that 70s and 80s period?
I think it was really rough. They didn't get punk rock. They didn't get it. They probably figured it was kind of a phase or whatever. That they didn't understand what happened to me. They kind of blamed punk rock because I didn't let them know I was a drug addict. Not something you tell your mom and dad. At least not over here, you don't. And so there was a lot of problems there. But my dad sort of came over and he came down. He would come down to shows. He saw the Kennedys. He saw TSOL. He came to Flipper, which was in the book. It was a pretty bad thing to happen. So my dad got involved. My mom never did. But then there was a progression of for a while. And when I sort of lost touch with everybody, I didn't talk to people for 3 years when I really hit the skids. And then when I was in trouble, they all came to my aid, and they're the ones that paid for the lawyer. And I'm not getting inheritance. They got me a lawyer, and I'm fine with that deal. Not that there's inheritance anyway, but the last 20 years I had an amazing relationship with my dad. We got a relationship back together. He died a year and a half ago. But he's the one that encouraged me to go to graduate school. He's the one that he read my first book and helped edit it. He was and I think that answered a lot of questions for him.
Yes.
It's a book that sort of my decline from humans, and there was, I think he was really, really happy. I think I was sort of lost for 20 years there, and I was a heroin addict for 18 years, so it's kind of lost there. And I renewed a friendship, but I was also not. I have two sisters. I was not in their lives. I was just sort of gone, and I'm trying to repair all that. And fix that. So I like to think that everything is good now, and I really like to think that my dad was actually proud of me before he died. And but to answer your question, they had a really hard time. They had a really hard time with it. Not easy thing to see your kid become a degenerate.
And what happened to Annalisa?
Annalisa, we were in touch forever. She actually lived my mom has a building in San Francisco, and she lived in the basement of the building, basement apartment for the years that she stayed there. We kind of had a falling out, but nothing a couple of years ago, and she lives in Santa Cruz. We're not in touch, but I see her at shows and things like that when I'm in the Bay Area. We're good. We're very good. She got her own life together. She too is a rabid vegan. All this stuff. And exercise like a fiend. And she, like me, she teaches college. She went on to write a doctorate, and she teaches. She helps kids go from high school to college. She does that kind of transition. I teach college. My other job is I teach English and creative writing in college. So there's a certain, it's sort of bizarre that punk sort of evolved into, working people.
Yes, no, God, it's kind of almost a happy ending there, isn't it?
Yeah,
It's like
yeah, it is.
Hollywood
It is.
ending.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
beautiful. God.
yeah. I'm really happy for the bands that are out playing. I mean, TSOL's back out. They play tours all the time. Flipper does something weird. I don't know what they are. The Subhumans come here all the time, and I always say I'm gonna go down there and never do because I don't really go to shows anymore. It's like it just doesn't appeal to me. And also, to tell you the truth, I don't know what to do with myself at a show because I'm not working. So I worked at shows for 10 years. I worked in the industry. And I go down to show. I'm sort of milling around. Where I stand? What do I do?
Yes.
It feels kind of weird. And so I just haven't seen the Subhumans, and I really should go see them one of these times like that. And I wish the Kennedys would write some new music. That's what I kind of hope. But other than that, I'm really happy to see there's a resurgence of interest in the band. I think there's a resurgence of interest enough that my book got out. That people sort of want to know what happened there because we're nostalgia now.
Well, it's interesting because I think last year or two there was a book on the there's photographic books on the Texas is the reason. That was a photographic book, and there was another photographic book on Boston, and Kevin Cummins, who did lots of stuff with the Sex Pistols and Joy Division photographic books. They all came out. Yeah. I think there is this thing, a passing of time, which I think I've put down to about 25 to 35 years. It's suddenly like periods then become quite interesting, other parts of the 80s, and I think that's where your book captures so much. But I think if you tried to have written that book, or you couldn't have done, but if that had come out in the 90s, or I don't know, in the early years, it probably wouldn't have been that interesting. But now it's like, wow, that really captures a whole scene in so much detail, doesn't it? And people are interested. I mean, that whole thing with CBGBs and Max's Kansas City and the Mud Club. I mean, they've all come out, and it's like, oh yeah, that's an interesting bit. So it's incredible.
I went down I did go see TSOL a couple of years ago, and I was in the when I wasn't on stage. I don't have a backstage pass anymore. I went and saw them play, and I was really amazed because the audience was a bunch of people like me, my age, and then the audience was like a bunch of kids, like 18-year-olds, like really young kids that were not around when that first album came out, singing along to their songs that they know from albums that came out in the 80s. And I was like really amazed. I was like, that's really interesting. That's really cool. And I find that much more refreshing than going to see the newer, bigger, generic punk bands that are out there. I think that's great. So, and TSOL is a kind of band that actually is writing new music. So that's interesting too.
Yes. And just last question, if you could have whispered something to your 16-year-old self starting out. I mean, yes, I know it's a tricky one, isn't it? Even if that 16-year-old self would have just ignored you, what would you have just said to them?
I would really told them not to be afraid, just to go out and do what you want to do. And that sounds funny because I went out and did what I do, but a lot of things kept me back with fear. I think I was afraid to really go out there and put my band out there. I was afraid to get my art out there. I didn't know how to deal with people. There's a lot of fear. And one of the reasons I did a lot of drugs is because I had social anxiety with people, and it cut that out. And the other thing is also, I just have to take things so seriously, man. I just was, it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to screw up. It's okay to, you're not going to be perfect. And that fear and that perfectionism, whatever, kept me from, doing a lot of things. When I was younger, I would just get up and go and hitchhike across country and do things like that. And as I got older, I got more fearful. Like, I think we all do, kind of, we sort of get like, what someone's going to, judge us for our outcome and what we're able to do. And that's really the answer. And the other, I tell them, is don't do heroin.
Yes.
which you couldn't have told me anyway, because everybody said you're going to go to prison or you're going to die. And I was like, I OD'd 9 times and I went to prison once. So, and I was like, that's not going to happen. But
I know.
But,
yes, well, I was just going to say, Lemmy was always so dead against heroin, wasn't he?
Yeah.
From Motorhead, he just said, it'll just make you a dog.
Right. Yeah, but he was addicted to meth, so
yes, he took a superior idea of his drug taking, didn't he? Really?
Right. I mean, We are our own limitations. We are our own limitations, and I constantly push that now. I got these ideas that oh, someone will judge me for this, and at this point in my life, I don't really care. I'm just going to do what I'm going to do. I put myself out there. Yeah, I'm playing music now. I'm not playing for other people, and I'm not proficient and also rusty because I haven't played a lot, and I make a mistake, and it's just like before I would be horrified that happened, and now I'm like, yeah. I saw the Stones play a couple of years ago, like 9 years ago, not a couple, but 9-10 years ago, and they were playing this huge arena in Oakland Arena, just giant, mega, things everywhere, and I went down and saw them, and Ron Wood and Keith Richards like both played a off chord. They made a mistake in Jumping Jack Flash or something, and they looked at each other and laughed. I was like, that is cool. That's like, yeah. I made a mistake. I'm Keith Richards, and I flubbed that chord. Yes. And I like that freedom of that, man. Because I would go home and think about that for a week, and they just like, yeah, this happens. This is what happens. I think that's important. It's really
yes.
important.
Well, I think that's right. That's very wise. You've just got to give yourself a bit more. Yes. Yeah, slack really, haven't you? And and not have those kind of voices. The critic in you just has to be silenced a bit, really, and just no one really is paying that much attention most of the time, are they? Really?
No, they're self-absorbed. They're thinking about themselves, man. That's the problem. You think they're judging you, they don't even notice you, not even on the radar.
No, this is true. Actually, this is true. But look, thank you ever so much, Patrick, for giving me the time for this. This has been amazing. If you want, I can always send you the link to this, and you can always use it elsewhere.
Oh, I would love to. This is awesome, David. This has been a real pleasure talking.
No, this has been fantastic, and thank you ever so much. The book's been amazing. And,
cool.
I'm really looking forward to reading more of it. But look, have a lovely day, and I'll keep in touch. But again, thank you ever so much for your time. I really appreciate this. Okay.
You too. Thank you for asking me.
Cheers. Bye. Bye. And that, dear listener, just in case you didn't realise, is the end of the interview. A massive thank you to Patrick O'Neill, whose book Anarchy at the Circle K on the Road with the Dead Kennedys, TSOL, Flipper, Subhumans and Heroin is available, as I said, from all good bookshops and also online. This is part of Punk Hostage Press. This has been the C86 Show, David Eastaugh. If you want to contact me, you can on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Just do C86 Show. And these have all been archived on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean. True. Anyway, have a great week. Stay safe.